Thank you. Our ability to communicate using words is at the heart of pretty much everything that humans ever do. Any transient thought that comes to our mind can immediately, and for most of us without any effort, be shared with those around us. Since the invention of writing systems over 5,000 years ago, we've been able to use words to make permanent records of our thoughts that we can share with people we've never met, with people not yet born. Since the invention of the telephone 150 years ago, we've been able to use words to share our thoughts instantaneously with people many miles away. This ability to store and share ideas have fundamentally changed the world we live in. They allow technologies to develop incrementally, with each generation building on the knowledge that's passed down to them from the generation before. This ability to share and pass down information have profoundly shaped our society, both for the better and for the worse. Put simply, our ability to label ideas with words has allowed our transient internal thoughts to exist beyond our own minds. As an experimental psychologist, I see my job as to understand the how. How do our human minds and the words that our minds have created provide this ability? What is the nature of the representations that you hold in your minds? What are the complex computations that operate on these representations that hopefully are allowing you to understand the words that I'm saying and build a reasonably accurate, meaningful representation? Let's start with a really simple scenario. Let's imagine a family going on holiday. Parent packing the booty to the car says to the child, "Bring me your suitcase." What does the child need to do? Well, for communication to be successful, they need to build an appropriate representation that allows them to behave appropriately, to bring the correct object so that it can be put in the car with the other objects. So if we think particularly about the final word in the sentence, the word suitcase, they need to build a representation that allows them to go and get the right object. How might the child do this? Well, as with all things to do with the cognitive psychology of language, we start from the work of Dorothy Bishop, former president of this society, and now proudly former fellow of the Royal Society. This is a paper that she published in a figure from a paper she published in QJP about 30 years ago, summarizing the computations involved in understanding a simple sentence. This classic cognitive psychology box and arrow diagram beautifully summarizes the processes involved in understanding a simple sentence. She describes it as an information processing model. And the general principle here is that to understand a simple sentence requires a sequence of processing stages, going from the top, basic acoustic processing, all the way down to things not actually drawn in the text, but talked about in the, not drawn in the figure, but talked about in the text, of high-level inferencing. This talk focuses on just one stage in this complex series of computations, what Dorothy referred to as lexical semantic lookup, the process by which we access the meanings of the words that we've encountered. And in this phrase, lexical semantic lookup, Dorothy's capturing a core idea of pretty much every model in psycholinguistics over the last 50 years, the idea of the mental lexicon. This idea that we all have a dictionary lurking in our mind that contains some stored, relatively stable knowledge about words. And this information is shared. And this idea of the mental lexicon is core to this talk. So today I'm going to start with talking about the mental lexicon. Dorothy's notion of the mental lexicon, many other people have talked about it. To some extent, it has to be true, right? We have to have some kind of dictionaries in our mind. For us to be able to communicate with each other, you and I and every other member of our language community must have some kind of relatively permanent, conventionalized notion of what each word means. But I think things start to become more interesting when we think more deeply about the content of what our mental lexicon might look like. So let's go back to our child about to go on holiday. Let's imagine instead of the word suitcase, we'd finished the sentence, or the parent had finished the sentence. Bring me your case. A more frequent word, at least in my dialect, probably the word I'd be more likely to use. If we look the word case, highly frequent short word up in a dictionary, you find what you nearly always find for high frequency short words. A whole catalogue of different possible interpretations. And we've heard a lot about this earlier today for those of you who were in the symposium. Case can refer to an instance, a case of mistaken identity, a case of COVID. It can refer to a legal case. It can refer to the linguistic case, the accusative case, the cigarette case, and or, in this case, the suitcase. So for communication to be successful, the child not only needs to know the meaning of the word, they need to know which meaning of the word is appropriate in their current context. This idea of context dependency, something we've heard a lot about this afternoon. And it's most clearly evident in homographs. Words like trunk. This word means something utterly different if we're talking about the trunk of a tree, the trunk of an elephant, the trunk of a car, or a large suitcase that we might put things in. These words, you have to take account of the context in order to understand these words. But I think this idea of context dependency is ubiquitous. All words have context-dependent meaning, and we've known this for a long time. So a word like lemon, we all agree which objects in the world the word lemon refers to. But we've known from the 1970s, from word recall tasks, and probably more convincingly from some priming work, that the way in which you process lemon depends on the task context, the situational context you're in. The extent to which a lemon is predominantly something that you think of as yellow or round, or you think about its weight, depends on whether you're going to eat it, cut it, or throw it at somebody. Depending on the context that you're currently in, you will access different constellations of semantic features. So how do we cope with this? How do we cope with context dependency? Well, the mental lexicon approach, this idea that you've got a stored dictionary in your head, very clearly says that it's some kind of retrieval plus selection. So if we take just one summary of the kind of conventionalized agreement about what's going on. If we look at something that I wrote in an article that was meant to be a kind of consensus, what do we all agree on? The literature has converged on the view that whenever a listener or reader encounters an ambiguous word, such as bark, they rapidly and automatically retrieve in parallel, at least to some extent, all the meanings that they know for this word. The dog noise, the tree covering. And then, within a few hundred milliseconds, select the single meaning that is most likely to be correct. So this idea of meaning selection is vital. And we can think of this as a kind of a subtractive approach to semantic processing, right? We've got accessible to us this vast array of knowledge, and our task is to select down, to hone in on the things that are relevant right now. This idea of the mental lexicon approach is something that I've thought about a lot, and something I talked about in a paper which Kathy very kindly referred to as my manifesto, which I really like the idea of a manifesto. This is just one perspective on what the mental lexicon might be. And I'm going to talk about three characteristics of this approach to thinking about the mental lexicon. This is fundamentally connectionist in nature. So a lot of the things that Blair talked about this afternoon are relevant here. We're talking about how a model might perform the mapping from the form of a word to its meaning, with a real focus on lexical ambiguity, the case where that form to meaning mapping is difficult. Again, as with some of the work that Blair talked about, semantic settling, this active dynamic process, is at its heart. And I'll talk a bit about how I see that as a way of implementing a much more general phenomenon to do with constraint satisfaction. And as Matthew helpfully summarized for me, It's got learning at its heart, this idea that lexical knowledge is flexible. So let's start with just a kind of little toy depiction of the model. It's connectionist, so we're talking about an input feature or representation of the form of a word feeding forward to some kind of feature or representation of its meaning. And these models were ubiquitous at the time that I was starting to first think about word meanings in the 1990s. But typically what these models did was they considered unambiguous words. So a word like ant were a single input representation, a single set of features fed forward to a single set of features that correspond to its meaning. And if you have this strictly feed-forward process, you really start to run into problems when you think about ambiguous words. So if you have a word like bark and you train the model, and on some trials the model learns to map a particular set of input features forward onto a particular set of semantic features, but on other trials you map it forward onto a different set of features because tree bark has different features to dog bark. And let's say you give it lots of training trials. So over time, intermixed with lots of other training items, you give it the chance to learn both of these meanings. What happens on test? What happens when you just give it the input and you say, what is a bark? What semantic features are now relevant? Well, a strictly feed-forward model, the very best it can do is to produce some kind of weird, hybrid, weighted mashup of the two meanings that it's seen. And very clearly, this is not what people do. Right? We tend to get our intuition and the experimental results are very clear on the fact that you hit on one meaning or the other reasonably quickly. And what we've argued for quite a long time now is that the way that people solve this is by having sophisticated lexical semantics, sophisticated knowledge of which features can co-occur and which features can't. And that this co-occurrence knowledge supports disambiguation. So, for example, a model might have connections within this lexical semantic representation that will tell it that two features, such as is brown and is rough, can be coactive. These are allowed to coexist. All of your experience with the world tells you that these are things that can belong together. And you might strongly interconnect those. But equally important, you might learn that certain features cannot co-occur, that things that are brown cannot also be loud. And what the model learns over time is which patterns are sensible, meaningful, stable patterns, and which are nonsense. For those of you who know the connectionist terminology, we're talking about attractor basins here. We're talking about these stable states. But really, this is just one implementation of a much more generic notion that's been around for many, many years, this idea of constraint satisfaction. That what the model is trying to solve is the fact that it's getting conflicting cues as to what the answer is. And what it's trying to do is sort this out in a way that it comes up with an answer that is the best possible guess given all of the constraints that it has available to it. And this allows it, at least in theory, to integrate cues from a wide range of different contextual sources. So that's one approach to thinking that I think is helpful to think about what the mental lexicon might be. This approach really highlights the flexibility, this idea that we can change our mental lexicon, that we're not stuck, we don't learn words as kids and then we're stuck with the representations that we had the day we turned 18. And this is something that my lab's been studying a lot over the last 10 to 15 years. This idea of flexibility. How do our experiences with word change and shape our knowledge about word meanings? We've done some work looking at the kind of long-term history. This is really about the histories of words. How does our history, our personal history with a particular word, impact on how that word is represented? Just like Kathy picked on one of her papers, which she called her favourite paper, very kindly. I agree, this is still my favourite paper. So one of the experiments in this, we looked at rowers and we looked at how their unique experience with highly familiar words like square and feather changes over time with their increasing experience with the weird world of rowing. But we've done much more work looking at much more short-term experience, word meaning priming, how within the time frame of a couple of minutes to maybe 24 hours at the most, we're changing how we interpret these ambiguous words. So word meaning priming is the title for a very generic paradigm. Any word meaning priming experiment will contain some kind of prime phase where the participants will encounter words within a context. So here the ambiguous word bank is really strongly disambiguated. There's very little ambiguity left at the end of the sentence as to what the word bank should mean. We then typically introduce some kind of delay, maybe 2 minutes, maybe a day, and then we introduce some kind of task to measure how our prime has changed the way this word is being interpreted. So we might do a very unconstrained word association task where we don't give them a context and we see what they do with it, or we might give them a very constrained context, something like semantic relatedness, where we see how quickly and easily they can retrieve a particular meaning of that word. As Kathy has helpfully summarized, one of the first experiments we did was this highly naturalistic experiment where listeners heard on the radio these paragraphs that contained highly ambiguous words, like ace here, which is being used in a strongly subordinate, very low frequency tennis-related meaning. And participants then logged on and did a very unconstrained word association task if they wanted to. And this was my first step into online experiments, and the fact that you could collect 2,500 participants without paying them within 24 hours kind of blew my mind. But what we saw in the results is that the way people interpreted these words was being influenced by whether or not they had heard the program. So compared to control participants who didn't happen to listen to the program, they were more likely to interpret these words in a way that was consistent with the prime. And we could also plot the kind of delay function, that we saw the biggest effects in the people who logged on and did our task really quickly. There's lots of nasty methodological confounds in this task, so obviously we then replicated it back in the lab with the usual multi-version, counterbalanced, obsessive designs that we always use. So compared to an unprimed control condition where people are sometimes generating these meanings anyway because they do exist in their brains and sometimes they just spontaneously go for the subordinate meaning. But if they heard that meaning of that word 1 minute earlier, you see a very large boost to the availability of that meaning that then subsides slightly out at 20 minutes and is relatively stable at a 40-minute delay. And since those early experiments, we've done a lot of word meaning priming studies, and we've learned a lot about word meaning priming. One of the first things we showed was that these boosts are bigger than the equivalent boost you might see if you don't repeat the word itself. There seems to be a specific contribution of encountering exactly that lexical item on multiple occasions. And we showed this back in 2013, and then we've very recently gone back and replicated this with a more appropriate sample size. Adam Parker has recently shown that you can see these effects using less metalinguistic eye tracking measures. Hannah Betts, a number of years ago, did some nice experiments showing that these things kind of pattern in a sensible way, right? If you have multiple encounters with a word, you'll get a bigger priming effect, and if you space those encounters out, again, that's beneficial. We've even shown that you can get similar sorts of phenomenon across languages when you have language pairs such as English, Dutch, which share word forms. In particular, if you switch from a word form in English to using it in Dutch, but with a different meaning, you can show that impedes comprehension. So this is a highly replicable phenomenon showing that people are changing the way they interpret words based on their recent experience. So this is a form of flexibility, right? We're not just tied to always interpret things in the same way. We can use our recent experience to guide our future processing. And we spent a long time trying to think, what's going on here? What are we changing? So if we take a really conventional model box and arrow diagram of the mental lexicon, this idea that you might have representations of the spellings of words, the sounds of words, and the meanings of words, which bit of the mental lexicon are we changing when we prime these? And we started off thinking, okay, what we're changing is people's form to meaning mapping. We're strengthening connections. We're making it easier to get from form to meaning. But we're now pretty certain that's not right, mainly because we see very strong cross-modal transfer. So it seems unlikely that we're learning something specific about how the sounds or the print should be processed. So we then, for a while, kind of settled on, okay, what we're doing is we're changing something within lexical semantics within your mental lexicon. we're making these meanings more strongly represented. Your tractor basins are deeper and stronger and easier to get into. It's still logically possible, but it's now not the way I think about these. And why have I changed my mind? Well, yeah, everything was kind of going really well until then. When I had this nice paper, manifesto, saying how I thought the mental lexicon was going. And then I encountered what I've called here the peanut problem, but in my head it's not called the peanut problem. In my head it's called the Kathy Rastel problem. So she raised this a couple of times with me. Like, yes, but Jenny, how does your model do this? And she was absolutely right. So here's the peanut problem. And the peanut problem comes from one of the most beautiful psycholinguistics experiments. I'm not going to go through the details of the methods, but here is the stimuli. So participants, this is an EEG experiment, they would be reading paragraphs like this. A woman saw a dancing peanut who had a big smile on his face. The peanut was singing about the girl he had just met. And judging from the song, the peanut was totally crazy about her. The woman thought it was really cute to see the peanut singing and dancing like that. It's fine. Yeah. We have no problem comprehending that paragraph. The key bit of the experiment then was participants would see a sentence, the peanut was, with two possible completions. On some trials, they would see the equivalent of the peanut was salted, and on other trials, the peanut was in love. And they used their EEG method to get a measure of how weird is that completion, how expected is that completion. Now, clearly, if the context doesn't exist, you would expect to see a big N400 for the peanut was in love, because being in love is not something that peanuts typically do, whereas the peanut was salted should be the expected completion of that sentence. But what they showed in their results is the context paragraph completely flipped that on its head. So that by creating this little narrative about a singing, dancing, funky peanut, it's now more expected, more reasonable that the peanut can be in love than that it can be salted. So they're building some kind of new representation, right? The peanut is now, this is what it looks like in my head. I don't know what it looks like in your head. But in my head, I'm building some representation of this kind of peanutty, funky dude. And this really makes us see how flexible is the lexicon? Is the lexicon like building this whole new representation in the space of a paragraph? Well, of course it's not. That just seems highly unlikely. But as Kathy says, how does my model cope with this? And of course it can't. So clearly this mental lexicon approach, this idea that you see a word and you retrieve a stored, stable knowledge, set of information from your mental lexicon, can't be all there is. There has to be something more. So what more is there? Well, the more will come as no surprise for those of you who've been in the symposium today. I think this mental lexicon approach is limited in, certainly as I've presented it, has limited in the scope it provides for prediction and in the contribution it allows for episodic memory. So let's first think about prediction. As somebody who studies lexical ambiguity, prediction effects and context effects are kind of the same thing. So we know context effects are strong. We know the main thing that will determine whether you think bark refers to the covering of a tree or the sound of a dog is the other words that occur in that sentence. So the tree bark is a very different sort of bark than the dog bark. And we've known this for a long time from eye tracking studies. But we've also increasingly become aware that a whole other range of cues form part of the context that disambiguates. To pick just one of the many, many cues that guide disambiguation, we now know that listeners will take account of the dialect that the speaker is using so not just when I'm listening to somebody, I'm not just thinking about my dialect, I can take account of your dialect, assuming it's one that I'm familiar with. So how do these forms of context operate? Well, one option is selection, right? You access all the meanings in parallel and then you select and you use context to guide that selection process. But you can equally frame this as a prediction problem or a prediction process. That when you hear a phrase that includes dog or tree, that's guiding your prediction as that you're expecting something that's related to dogs or something that's related to trees. And maybe that's what's kind of guiding your settling process into one meaning or the other. When it comes to lexical ambiguity, I think the literature is equivocal. I don't think, with the possible exception of some of the data that Kathy talked about earlier, I don't think we've got compelling evidence as to whether it's better to think of these as selection processes or prediction processes. But if we take off our kind of lexical ambiguity goggles and we look at the field more widely, the evidence for some form of prediction being critical here is now overwhelming. So the last couple of years have seen some really wonderful papers bringing together all of the work that's been done on prediction. This paper by Riskin and Newland, and also this one by Wong et al. And I think these papers force us to think really carefully about the role of prediction in processing word meanings. To be clear, I'm not talking about any particular prediction framework here. I'm just talking really general about the notion that as you're processing words, you're making predictions about the content of what comes next. So I think the evidence base is increasingly compelling. I think some of the neuroimaging, EEG, fMRI work has been particularly important here. And just to take a couple of quotes from this paper. Listeners and readers use all manner of contextual information to generate multifaceted predictions about upcoming input. And this one's probably even more important, that constraining context can result in pre-activation of relevant information before the onset of a word. So before you get to the ambiguous word, you're already generating some predictions about what's coming next. To be clear, I'm not necessarily talking about lexically specific predictions. So I'm not saying you're necessarily predicting which word is coming next in the sentence. I'm talking about making semantic predictions. Which area of semantic space are you currently living in, and where are you expecting to go next? I think that is relatively uncontroversial. I think the lexical specificity of predictions, that's still up for debate, but I think the idea that you're making some generic predictions about the area of semantic space that you're expecting to land is fairly uncontroversial. I'd just like to highlight here that I'm not just talking about prediction in the sense of a preview, that a prediction can help you get there faster because you started the process early, but also that predictions can access important, meaningful information that can change the way the word is going to be processed. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. So that's prediction. The second component that I think the strict mental lexicon approach is missing is the role of episodic memory. Now, it may start to feel like, yeah, episodic memory, everybody's talking about episodic memory, but people talking about the mental lexicon, this was not something that we've historically talked about at all. But I think there's increasingly compelling evidence for the role of episodic processes in word meaning access. So when you encounter a word, the information that comes to mind straight away that helps you understand that word doesn't just come from your mental lexicon, but also comes from any available episodic memory. And I think we heard some really elegant data earlier today from Matthew Mack. So the idea is that words, to some extent, kind of act as a retrieval cue and allow it to come to mind any relevant episodic memories. Any relevant recent encounters with those words where you've started to bind together a word within a particular situational context. And that whatever lexical task you're using, be it semantic relatedness, lexical decision, whatever, you're going to see impact of these episodic memories. So, for example, if I was to get you to do some kind of psycholinguistic task now, and one of the items was the word trunk, your ability to say trunk is related to elephant or trunk is a concrete noun would be impacted by the fact that at least some of you would start to bring to mind some of those pictures I showed you earlier about elephant trunks and tree trunks and so on, and that we can't separate that out when we're looking at how people comprehend words. So let's go back to word meaning priming, right? Where I've talked about this idea that your recent experience can change how you process words. And we spent, a good 10 years trying to figure out where in the lexicon we were changing people's representations. And I now think we weren't. We weren't changing. Certainly in the experiments not involving sleep, I don't think we were ever changing anything in their mental lexicon. I think what we were seeing was the impact of these kind of hippocampal episodic representations. that word meaning priming was driven by reactivation of the memories that you'd started to build of the sentences that you encountered early on in the experiment. So you're reactivating representations that are recent. You're reactivating contextually specific associations. So if you remember the prime sentence about the seal coming up onto the bank, Matthew had a lovely picture of that. You're evoking those associations between riverbanks and animals and water and everything that you experienced in that particular episode. You're not putting that information into your lexicon, you're putting that information into the ongoing temporary store that you're using to make sense of the world, to make sense of the linguistic information that you're encountering. So where does that leave us? Let's revisit the child, okay? So in the case of bring me your suitcase, what do we think is going on? Well, the mental lexicon is still at the heart of this approach. The stored, shared knowledge about what suitcase means, what case means, is still at the heart of this. But I think we need to think more broadly about the range of information that comes to mind when the child is trying to understand the word suitcase. So we need to think about their predictions. So the idea is they've got a context. They're in a context. That context involves words that will allow them to make some semantic predictions. So bring me your, we're predicting some concrete, carryable, familiar object. We might be able to make a much more specific prediction in the context of a car boot that's half full of suitcases. We might be using syntactic cues, we might be using pragmatic cues. We've got a whole array of cues that will allow us to make a prediction about what area of semantic space we're about to go into, what constellation of semantic features might be relevant when the next word comes along. So we can use the context to generate a prediction where that prediction is meaningful semantic information. Then the word arrives, then case arrives, and that word itself then allows us to activate some set of semantic features. And that's your stored, shared, stable mental lexical knowledge. And what I'm claiming at the moment is your representation of what that word means is the combination of those two things. If you remember, I talked about constraint satisfaction, semantic settling. These are the kinds of processes that I'm imagining allow you to fluently combine these. So the prediction isn't just allowing you to get to the meaning faster. The meaning is activating useful semantic content that you then have to combine with the information that's available when you encounter the word. But that's not all. You've also got episodic memory. So if the child has recently encountered the word case, so 10 minutes ago they were being nagged to pack the case and put their pajamas in the case, and I've told you 3 times to put your pajamas in the case, then when the word casing is re-encountered, those memories are able to be re-evoked and can contribute to how that word is processed. And I'm using Gareth and Matthew's terminology here, these contextual bindings, that you're binding this word case with your recent contextual information. And the argument here is that word meaning is all of this. That in order to understand what somebody is saying, you have to bring all of this to mind in order to retrieve an appropriate meaning for a word. All right, let's unpack this a bit. Oh, by the way, so you might have noticed the gap there. It may well be also that you generate some episodic memories generated by the context, but I'm not aware of any strong evidence for that, so let's leave that to one side for now. So let's unpack the model as it currently stands. So I'm saying there are at least 3 components to word meanings. We've still at the heart got the mental lexicon, your stored, shared knowledge of what a word means, this conventionalized knowledge. But you've also, in the moment that you're processing that word meaning, got your prediction as to what you were expecting the next thing to mean. And in the case where you've got recent experience with that word, you may also have some episodic-like contextual bindings. Let's simplify the diagram. Word meanings comprise at least 3 components. Lexical knowledge that needs to be combined with your prediction and your contextual bindings. Right, for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to talk through some case studies. And by case studies, I don't mean people, I mean words. So rather than try and set out a compelling case in terms of experimental evidence as to why you should believe this new approach, I'm going to try and show you the value. What do we gain from thinking about word meanings in this way? So let's start with the easy words. Familiar, unambiguous words. Words where there's very little uncertainty as to what they mean. So where the child is being told to bring me your suitcase. Suitcase is beautifully unambiguous in as much as any word is unambiguous, and hopefully for this child is a familiar word. So let's think about the 3 components. What is their contextual prediction going to be? Well, without knowing the exact scenario, we can't say, but it's probably going to be some fairly vague, unspecified, generic representation of something that's carryable, concrete, familiar, but might be more specific. So they've got a contextual prediction about what suitcase is going to mean. They then encounter the word itself, which allows them to bring to mind some fairly generic knowledge of what a suitcase is, right? Typical models of mental dictionaries assume that this is the stored, shared stuff that we've generalized across all the suitcases we've ever encountered. So it's probably just quite generic in terms of what a suitcase is. It'll contain information about its size, shape, function, and so on. What about contextual bindings? Well, in the scenario where the child was discussing the suitcase with their parent 5 minutes earlier, the contextual bindings might be doing all the work here, right? The contextual bindings might allow them to bring to mind the very specific suitcase that it was that they packed 5 minutes ago. The suitcase might be very distinctive and have all kinds of additional cues that are ultimately going to tell the child what suitcase to go and get. And you will use kind of constraint satisfaction processes to combine these 3 possible cues. So the key thing about familiar and ambiguous words is they're a low conflict scenario. We can't really, when the child behaves appropriately, we don't really know, was that because they made good predictions, because they had good lexical knowledge, or they had some good episodic memories. I think what happens in most cases for these sorts of words is your lexical information, your episodic memories, add specificity to your predictions. But these are the kind of easy ones. Right, let's think about ambiguous words now. So let's imagine the slightly unusual scenario where the parent said, bring me your trunk, because we're in some kind of weird Harry Potter land at the moment. So bring me what is the contextual prediction? Has to be the same, right? Some kind of general idea of some carryable object. What's the lexicon going to do here when they encounter the word trunk? Well, I think there's compelling psycholinguistic evidence that says when you encounter an ambiguous word, you bring to mind all the relatively familiar interpretations of that word. So the child is likely to generate information to do with car trunks, tree trunks, elephant trunks, and if we're lucky, the subordinate meaning of the word trunk. What's going to happen with the contextual binding? Well, again, if we're lucky, if the child has encountered this word in their recent linguistic history, it will bring together a very specific instantiation of that trunk. And the disambiguation process is the resolving of these different cues. The contextual prediction on its own is probably enough, right? Because elephant trunks and tree trunks are not things that can be brought to the car in that particular contextual situation. So in most cases, the contextual prediction will be enough to disambiguate the word. But again, the contextual bindings may then add additional specificity. So for ambiguous words, the lexicon initially generates mutually incompatible representation. And the constraints that allow you to disambiguate that may come from contextual predictions, but may also come from available episodic memories. And this is exactly what I've been saying about word meaning priming, that your recent encounters with those words can guide disambiguation. So far, so what, right? This way of thinking of things hasn't really bought us much. It's giving us a slightly different way of thinking about disambiguation, a slightly different way of thinking about how you know which suitcase to bring, but it's not really moving us forward much. Let's start thinking about unfamiliar words. So let's imagine the child is in the scenario where they have never heard the word luggage. That word just isn't in their mental lexicon. They have no clue what luggage is. The parent turns around and tells them to bring me your luggage. What is a child to do? Well, the child still has their contextual predictions, right? They have no lexical knowledge. The lexicon is utterly at sea here. And likewise, the contextual bindings are not helping because they have no recent experience of episodes that involve the word luggage. So all they have is the prediction. So if their prediction is accurate enough, they can go and get the right thing, right? If they are sure enough that the parent has a whole bunch of suitcases and they're being told to go and get something, they can probably assign an entirely rational, appropriate meaning for the word luggage and go off and do what they're told, and the parent will happily assume that their child knows what the word luggage is. I think those of us who've had young kids have had that feeling when you're reading them a storybook and you know that there's a whole heap of words in there, that they have no clue what they mean. But the child is just happily letting these words drift over them. And I think a lot of the time that's because they're making entirely appropriate predictions based on the context. So in the case of unfamiliar words, there is no information in the lexicon. The meaning of the word is entirely driven by the prediction. And I think this gives us an interesting way, maybe not a novel way, but an interesting way of thinking about how communication unfolds during development as words move from being unfamiliar to familiar, and similarly in additional language learning. When you're, as a second language learner as an adult, you regularly encounter word forms in your L2 or L8 or whatever you're learning that you've never encountered before. Because the key claim here is that even the most unfamiliar words have a meaning. Just because your lexicon is empty doesn't mean you don't know what that word means. In the moment of trying to understand what it is that your parent wants to do, the child has a meaning for the word luggage. It's just a fairly unspecified, vague meaning. And I think in this framework, we can start to think of vocabulary acquisition. And again, these are not new ideas. I'm just kind of bringing them together as an increased role of lexical knowledge in the way that words are processed. Right. The fourth and final part of the story. Newly created meanings. This is where we come back to the peanut, right? What is going on in those paragraphs? So let's just imagine, strip the experiment down. The woman saw a happy dancing peanut. What does this framework tell us is going on? Let's think about the contextual prediction. The woman saw a happy dancing. What area of semantic space am I in? What am I expecting? I'm expecting some kind of happy dancing peanut dude, right? So my contextual prediction here is really quite specific. It might be gender neutral. I might not be sure whether it's human or animal, but I'm predicting some kind of a happy dancing entity. Then I hit the word peanut. And that's where things start getting really hard. Because I have many, many years of experience telling me that what a peanut is a small edible kind of nut that often is covered in salt. So I've got these two really conflicting cues telling me how to process this word peanut. The first time I encounter the word in this paragraph, the contextual bindings are doing nothing for me because I've not encountered peanut in my recent history. So what am I to do? According to this account, I've got two sources of information. I've got my prediction, and I've got the information that I'm getting from my lexicon. And the best I can do is to use my constraint satisfaction processes, my semantic settling processes, to somehow resolve these, to reject the elements of meanings that are not compatible with both, and to hold on to the things that are compatible. And hopefully, if things go well, to generate some combination of the constellation of semantic features that I've got from these two sources, and generate some funky, happy, dancing peanut dude. Then the contextual bindings come into play, right? In that paragraph, the word peanut was used many times. So the first time I've encountered peanut, it's really hard, because I'm having to resolve these really inconsistent cues. But once I've decided what a peanut now means, every time within that experiment, within that paragraph that I encounter the word peanut, I can bring to mind the contextual bindings, this notion that I've created of a happy dancing peanut. So I think these newly created meanings are important, both because the traditional mental lexicon model really struggled with them, but I also think newly created meanings are a surprisingly common situation. So we're thinking of it here in terms of a meaning that the experimenter has created, that the reader will never encounter again. But actually throughout our lifespan, we are repeatedly, often encountering what are to us newly created meanings. The first time back in dark history, the first time that we saw the word tweet referring to a social media post, we were in exactly this situation. The context was telling us that this was something to do with social media. Our mental lexicon was telling us this was a noise that a bird was making. And we had these two incompatible sources of information that had to be resolved. The first time your students are in a statistics lecture and you use the word normal, they're bringing to mind their stored lexical knowledge of what normal means in the real world with this weird thing that you're telling them about statistical distributions that they don't quite understand. So the student is having to build a new representation for normal. This is high conflict. This is about as high conflict as we're getting for this kind of situation. And the context ultimately has to overrule the lexicon. The first time you encounter a novel meaning for a familiar word, you have to overrule however many years of experience you've had with that word and create a new meaning. And we know this is hard. We know that from word learning experiments, some done by Rachel, who's here in the audience, that learning these new unrelated meanings can be really hard. And we know that they're easier when there is some relationship. I think these kind of words also really emphasize how much episodic memory can bring to the party here. That the first time you encounter peanut, that's super hard, super cognitively demanding. But the second, third, fourth, fifth time, it becomes increasingly easier because you're bringing to mind this newly created representation that is hopefully sitting in your episodic memory. So, I'm nearly done. What are word meanings? She said in a somewhat grandiose manner. My proposal is still that the mental lexicon is at the heart of this. Our stored, conventionalized, agreed system of knowledge about what words mean is vital. But we need a more prominent role for prediction, and we need a more prominent role for episodic memory. That all of these sources of information combine to construct a new meaning. And I think these are best illustrated by novel word use, when we take a familiar meaning and we make it mean something new. The settling mechanisms that I set out early on are still important. In fact, they're probably more important. And for me, what's most exciting is it's allowing me conceptually to bring together the things that I think about in terms of word meaning processing with the ideas I have about word meaning learning. That word learning in this view becomes a gradient. That early in the life of span of a word, you're entirely reliant on your prediction because that's all you've got. And as you become a lexical expert on that word, the balance between prediction and retrieval will change. So we've got long-term store of lexical knowledge. This has to be highly structured, and in some sense it's always going to be the boss that most of the times will guide the semantic settling process. And notions that Kate has talked around about the quality and what it is about the journey and the history that words go through is really important to thinking about what that lexical knowledge looks like. But predictions are important, these statistical contingencies, how we guess about what is coming next. And again, to emphasize, I don't think predictions just give us a preview. I think they bring novel information to the party. They generate important content. And Kathy and her team have done some really important work thinking about how large language models can bring insights into quite how rich these predictions can be. I think we totally underestimated, maybe based on some of the closed test data, we underestimated how good at prediction people might be. And I think there's also some really important kind of more mechanistic stuff going on that we need to think about how we integrate those more mechanistic accounts of prediction with my very hand-wavy views. In terms of episodic memory, we need to start thinking about the journey of of learning in terms of these short-lived episodic memories and how this then might get transferred into the long-term changes that we make to words. And this is work that Gareth and Matthew are leading. I started from the mental lexicon approach, this idea that word meanings are stable, shared sets of knowledge. And I set out some data from word meaning priming experiments suggesting that the lexicon might be more flexible than previously thought. I still think the lexicon is flexible. You know, the rowers have to be able to incorporate this new information. But I'm now slowly coming around to the idea that actually word meaning processing is really flexible. But a lot of that flexibility comes from the variability that comes from predictions and comes from episodic memory contributions. I also started the talk with some various artworks. Partly because sometimes I didn't have any words I needed to put on the screen, but I also think the analogy between words and art is really useful here. Just as a particular work of art has the capacity to take us all on a slightly unique, idiosyncratic journey, I think words can do the same. Yes, they have shared core semantic knowledge, but they also bring with them a whole host of idiosyncratic and often very personal associations that are really part of what it means to understand that word. Some thank yous. Thank you to my magnificent UCL crew who just make working an absolute joy. Thank you to Matthew and Gareth who have turned my thinking on a lot of important things completely upside down. But thank you mostly to most of the people on this slide I think of as part of my EPS family. I've been coming to EPS meetings since the first year of my PhD. I hope it was evident that when I summarized the important contributions across those 3 columns, that it was really a who's who of some of the real stalwarts of EPS, people who've over the years made massive contributions to this society. If I have one piece of advice to give to early career researchers, it's make the EPS your home. Throughout your career, you may change institutions, but there's something magnificent about coming back every 3 months to this wonderful group of people. So, thank you.